Join me on an inspiring journey through the world of fitness, health, and performance with the Genetic Coach, where I delve deep into the genetic foundations of athletic endurance, discovering how genetics is revolutionizing our understanding of human potential and how we can unlock our full athletic capabilities through a fresh perspective on conventional practices. Hello, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining me again as we continue to look into the world of endurance athletes and what makes them tick. Science tells us that each athlete with their distinct genetic code responds to and interacts with their environment in a highly individual way, leading to personal and unique experiences. I don't know about you all, but when I see athletes performing in their spaces, I always want to know more about their story and peel back the layers on how they've found success, what they've learned along the way, and how that has shaped them into who they are today. It's an intriguing relationship, this interplay of genetics and environment, and I'm excited to peel back the layers on another athlete in the high-performing endurance world. Professional distance runner for Under Armour, Matt Llano. Matt has been living and training in Flagstaff, Arizona since 2012. He holds personal bests of 2:11:14 in the marathon and 61:47 in the half marathon, and has represented Team USA at the World Half Marathon Champs. So thanks so much for taking the time out to join us today, Matt, and welcome to the Genetic Coach podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm excited Emily connected us, and I'm excited to have a chat today.
Awesome. So Matt, I always like starting at the beginning, and with that in mind, maybe you can just tell us how it all started for you. Tell us more about your running career and at what age you realized your passion and your talent for running.
Yeah, I think I probably started like a lot of people. When I was younger, I just was involved in a ton of different sports. I first was a soccer player and I was a swimmer, both of those starting at probably age 4 or 5. And so I kind of maybe with those started getting a little bit of that intro to an endurance component to training. And even though I obviously didn't think of it as that at the time, but from there, I kind of got into basketball and baseball, and I did sailing for a little bit. Yeah, just kind of explored everything. And I think my earliest memories of really running for the sake of running were probably in elementary school. I remember I did an after-school program. I love telling the story. I did an after-school program where for every lap of, whatever the athletic fields were, you got a little charm that you completed. You got a little charm that I tied onto my shoelaces, and I kind of wore it as this badge of honor. I think it was shaped like a little shoe or like a little foot. And I think at the end of whatever the time period was, whether it was the school year, I don't remember how we measured it, I think I had the most little charms on my shoelaces. So kind of just a funny little story of apparently I really enjoyed the running at the time. And that was in elementary school. And then kind of as I moved into middle school and then into high school, some of the sports kind of started to fall off and fade away as I really prioritized, mostly at the time it was soccer and swimming. And then I kind of had to make this decision when I got to high school, because my soccer team that I was on was a full-time year-round travel squad. The swim team that I was on wanted me there, every morning and every afternoon. They were doing, twice a day training. And then at the same time, I started to also run track in high school. So I had these 3 sports that all demanded, all of my time. And so I kind of had to start to choose, what do I want to do? And the swimming I really loved, but I was a nerd in high school. So I was very academically inclined. And I felt that the swimming and 2-a-day practices was probably just a little bit too demanding of my time. So that one kind of fell by the wayside, and I just kind of started doing that as a summer sport. And then the soccer and the running is what I was down to. And I really loved both of them. But I think the coaching that I had in running really drew me more towards that. I really loved the coaches that I was, fortunate enough to be aligned with in high school. And I didn't so much love the soccer coaches. And so I think that helped make my decision a little bit easier, where I was like, I love the people that I'm doing the running with, and the soccer just started to feel more like a chore. I wasn't really enjoying going to the practices. I wasn't really enjoying going to the games. It was really like my parents were having to kind of twist my arm to get me to go. But the running, I never hesitated. I loved the team. I loved the coach, Coach Dobbs. And I think that's really kind of what drew me in. I played soccer, continued to play soccer my freshman and sophomore year in high school. And then junior year, decided to make the switch completely over to running full time, gave up soccer. And that's when I really started to taste a little bit of success in running and really started to find my footing. And then from there, it was kind of the natural progression of gradually just moving up in distance. And then I was fortunate to run in college and then just kind of continued running after. I knew that it was something I could pursue for a lifetime. And I liked that component of it as well, where, it wasn't something that I need to have organized with a bunch of other people like you would in soccer. I just loved that it was something that I could pursue, either on my own or as part of a team like you do in college here in the US. And really, yeah, just fell in love with it and fell in love with the lifetime component of it. And now here I am. That was, gosh, I'm 36 now. So that was when I started running full time, I was probably sophomore, junior in high school, 14, 15 years old. So I've been doing this over 20 years now, which is kind of crazy to think, but yeah, how the time flies.
Yeah, when you're doing something that you love and you're passionate about, you don't really realize the time frame, do you? I mean, was there any point in time with your running that you kind of questioned yourself and you said to yourself, why am I doing this? I know, there's obviously a point where, yes, you enjoy the sport that you're taking part in, but when you're getting to a certain level, you've really got to put in the hard yards. And I think for most athletes, there is a time where you kind of say to yourself, am I really up for this? Am I really enjoying this still? Has that happened to you in your career?
I would say for the longest time, I mean, we all have those days, right? Like every so often where you're going through an injury or you're missing your friends' weddings or I don't know, certain things throughout your life and career that do make you question it, maybe on like on a micro scale of, certain days. But I would say really overall, I never hesitated. I never really did experience those moments of questioning because it was something that I loved so much and I felt so dedicated to and resolved to, achieving the things that I had set out to do. Having said that, now, being in it for 20 plus years, I think I'm starting to get to a point in my life where I'm very interested in another career path and starting to pursue that more wholeheartedly. But I think for a long time, there was nothing that I felt drawn to enough that lit me up as much as running has for years and years. That's starting to change a little bit now as I'm getting a little bit older, but I still have that passion. I still have the desire to run and train, but it is just now starting to shift a little bit. So had you asked me that question even 6 months or a year ago, the answer would have pretty much been like a resolute no. But in the last 6 months or a year, I have started to see that transition a little bit where I have something and I feel so fortunate to have something else that's pulling on my heart. This is a little bit of a period of transition for me where I'm starting to explore another realm, but still holding on to running and just kind of changing my relationship with running a little bit so that I can still love running and pursue goals in that, even if they might look different than they did a few years ago.
I think they are. That's special to be able to have something that you can, a sport that you can continue in, make it a lifelong passion, even though it's maybe done at a slightly lower level. But if we go back to your actual running career, half marathon, marathon distances, where do you feel your strength lies? Or is it equal in both? And what is your favorite distance out of the two?
I think as I was growing up in the sport and as I was progressing through, high school and college and early years as a pro, I think I always was excited to just run longer and longer and longer. I thought the longer that I could run, the better. And so in my mind, it was always going to be the marathon. I think the way that it ended up kind of playing out, I think you could argue I maybe had some better performances at the half marathon. And I really love that distance. That would probably be like, if I really listen to what my gut tells me, it probably is that the half marathon is my favorite distance. But I also, just the marathon, there's so many things that can go wrong. There's just so much can go right, but I think you really have to have the pieces all fall into place on the right day for the marathon. And what I always struggled with that distance was that, if you have an off day, or if, you can't hold down your nutrition, or if you get, weather that's not ideal, like just so many other things can play into it. And then you don't really get another opportunity. If something goes wrong, you don't really get another opportunity to compete in another marathon for several months. I mean, most people maybe do one or two a year. And I always kind of struggled with that component of the marathon a little bit, where if I had an off day, I really wanted to come back, a few weeks later and try again. But that's just, most people's bodies don't allow them to do that. That being said, I think when you have a good day, like anything, when you have a good day, everybody loves the marathon. When you have a good day, everybody loves the half marathon. But if something goes wrong, oh man, it's just a tough pill to swallow and a long way to go. But yeah, all of that to say, I think the half marathon is a really sweet spot for me, and was probably, I think you could argue, my best performance was in the half marathon. And I think some of the races that I've had the most fun and maybe happiest memories with were with the half marathon.
Okay, so I'm really interested to get your genetics tested and to see where you lie on that spectrum of endurance and power, considering that you have had better results in the half marathon, best result in the half marathon. I mean, when you look at the type of workouts that you've done in your training, when you look at maybe sort of high intensity interval training versus longer, slower type runs, what do you find easier in terms of getting those workouts done? Or is there a difference for you?
I had a coach, it wasn't my coach, but somebody that I knew years ago that really talked about this. Greg McMillan really talked about, I think his words for it were like endurance monster or speedster. I think those were kind of the two of the main categories that how he termed them. And you have obviously an endurance monster, somebody that really excels in like long runs, tempo runs, stuff like that. And then speedster really excels in, track work, high intensity, short intervals. And I think for me, I always probably leaned more towards the endurance monster side, using his terminology. I think I tended to, and still probably do tend to recover better from just long efforts where I could go do a hard long run and be fine the next day. But if I went and did a short, fast track workout, my legs and my body might be wrecked for a few days and I might need more recovery from those. So I think that's kind of how my body always responded and how my body always worked in training. And I think especially now, as I've gotten older, I think it's just become a little bit more extreme, to where I might need, or ideally have 2, 3, 4 days after a track workout. Whereas a long run, I could probably come back a day or two later and do some kind of, hard session again. So I still think that I have that kind of endurance oriented training mentality. And I think as I've gotten older, it's just become a little bit more even pronounced than it used to be. I think when you're young, you can almost get away with anything, right?
Yeah.
Like you can do the things that I think of now that I used to do in training. I'm like, man, I ran hard every single day and was always fine the next day, and just bounced back into the next session and no problem. And now it's very different.
Yeah.
And so I think part of that is just age. And I think part of that is also probably just my strengths and weaknesses as a person. And maybe this testing will help kind of show some of these or maybe give some deeper insights into, the patterns I've been kind of noticing for years. So I'm excited to see what it shows.
Yeah. So you speak about working with coaches, and obviously, coaches have directed your training programs and what you're doing in your workouts. But you say that you're now self-coached. Can you just explain a little bit of the difference? Has that meant that more of your workouts now that you self-coached, you gravitating more towards the endurance style running workouts as opposed to doing those high intensity interval workouts? I mean, have you changed the dynamic of what you're doing in your training quite a lot to what you were doing previously when you were working with coaches?
I think I have to be a little bit careful with that. I think early in my career, when I first moved to Flagstaff in 2012, I coached myself for a little while. At the time, I really approached it as the training that I wrote for myself was only comprised of workouts that I liked doing, which tended to be things that I was already good at. And so I didn't address my weaknesses. Now, I really try to be cognizant of that because I noticed a dip in my performance at that time. And I think it was because I was neglecting some of the things that I had learned about training over the years. And obviously now, 12 years later, I've learned a lot more in the last 12 years. What I try to do now is really write out just a well-balanced training program where I'm hitting even the things that I don't like to do, or maybe the things that are my weaknesses. And I try to incorporate those because they're my weaknesses and because I know that they can have a good physiological benefit for me. I don't do them all the time because, like I was just saying, if I don't recover as well from them, maybe there's something to that. But I do think that there's a ton of benefit of touching on all these different systems. Even when getting ready for a marathon, I'll still do, fast 200s on the track. I'll still do hill repeats for, power and running form and running efficiency and all these things. But I need to obviously balance that with longer tempos and longer, threshold type work for the marathon, specific to the marathon. So I think I just kind of have learned over the years, how to create a well-balanced training program that works for me, and then make sure that I'm touching on all the different systems, because early on, I think I tended towards only the things that I liked, which really just, I think, exposed some of my weaknesses.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's an interesting thing. I mean, a lot of athletes, I mean, I'm a coach as well, and I work with a lot of athletes, and I think definitely over time, you can experiment with different types of workouts and you get to understand what works for a certain athlete through a little bit of trial and error, I guess. And that takes time to understand that. And I think what's changing now with genetic testing is that you can get those insights far earlier in one's career to kind of direct best practice. And it's never to say you'll only do this type of workout because this is what your genetics say that you respond best to, but it's about getting the balance right and that ratio right of, are we working on the aerobic system? Are we working on the anaerobic system? And what ratio do we focus our efforts when it comes to putting that program together? And I think that's what's so interesting with genetic testing. And yeah, like you say, super interested to see what your genetics say and how that actually correlates and relates back to what you've experienced in your running and in your training. And I've read a couple of your blogs and talking about when you were racing really at your highest levels, and you spoke a little bit about the difference between racing for time versus racing to be competitive and how that impacted your results at the end of the race. Can you maybe explain to us a little bit what you mean when you talk about racing to be competitive versus racing for time?
Yeah, I think this question I've thought about for years, really in the back of my mind. I always kind of wish that I had done it a little bit differently. I think a lot of times you see athletes that kind of tend to have a little bit of a different focus. You tend to see people that are more time trial oriented athletes that really just like to go to, like for marathons, they just like to go to the fast, Berlin, Chicago, the fast courses, and just try to run as fast as they can, always trying to set a new personal best. And then you have other athletes that tend to prioritize, like Boston and New York, that are really just going, gunning for top 5 finishes or top 10 finishes or podium finishes, but really aren't concerned about the times. And I think, that's obviously 2 very different approaches. I tended to always kind of lean more towards the times. And for whatever reason, when I first got into my marathoning career, that was just kind of the approach that excited me. There was so much focus at the time for American men trying to break 2:10 in the marathon. Nobody had really done it for a while. Obviously, in the last couple of years, we've had a resurgence of that, and now we've had a handful of people do it, which is great. But at the time, in 2014, 2015, 2016, nobody was really doing that from the US. And so that kind of became, for me, the really exciting goal, the thing that got me out of bed and got me motivated to go train every day was to try to break that 210 barrier. And I got close a couple times, but fell a little bit short. And so, but that was what excited me. And the idea of going to Boston and going to New York was exciting, but it just was harder maybe to wrap my mind around. And it felt like if I focused on a time, it was something that I could control. Like it was me against the clock. Whereas, when you're only focusing on the competition element, or you're just trying to go and beat other athletes, so much of that depends on the day that other athletes have too. And maybe that feeling of not having as much control. I'm very type A, so maybe I didn't like that, giving some of that control away. But in hindsight, I do kind of wish that I had done it a little bit differently, because I think if I'd really prioritized competing, I think the times would have come. I think that really just getting out there and focusing on beating other people naturally, you're, in order to beat those people, you're going to run fast and you're going to set records, and you're going to, the performances and the times are going to come with that. So I really wish that I had approached it a little bit differently when I was kind of very early in my career and in the prime. But I also, had great experiences of doing time trials and really trying to focus on staying within myself and seeing how much I could get out of myself. And maybe that was, again, maybe that was too much of a focus for me, where maybe I wasn't actually competitive enough in those races, but where I was just like, this is my goal. And if I can achieve this, that's good enough for me. Maybe I sold myself short on some of the days where I could have run a little better, run a little faster, placed a little higher. So I do wish that I had approached it a little bit differently, but I was always more time oriented versus place oriented or competition oriented.
But that maybe that also just speaks to the fact that you're very endurance sort of wired, and that pacing yourself to a certain strategy always, fits better with the more endurance type athlete, as opposed to someone who's maybe a little bit more power focused and, can enjoy that change in pace. But I mean, you've just come off the Chicago Marathon now, and you said to me that you were going to run it as a pacer. We've seen another record fall in the results of the women. But can you just explain to us what it means to be a pacer in a race like this? And you're obviously not racing for yourself, but you're racing to set somebody else up.
Yeah, this has been kind of one of those elements of the sport that I've been exploring the last couple of years, and I've really been enjoying it. And what I mentioned earlier, kind of, something else pulling on my heart a little bit. I'm feeling that in pacing a little bit too right now, where, for a long time, obviously in running, we tend to be so focused on ourselves and our own training and what's best for us. And we make all these sacrifices, and, we really try to set up our whole life around what's best for our running. And that's great for a long time, when you're happy and you're fulfilled from that. But for whatever reason, when you start to not have that fulfillment, I would encourage anybody to try pacing, because it really has started to fill a little bit of a gap for me, where I wasn't getting as much satisfaction from my own running, but now having the opportunity to help other people and take the focus off of myself, I've really been enjoying it. So this year in Chicago is my third official, pacing job. All three of them have actually been Chicago Marathon. I did it in 2021 for the men, and 2023 last year for the women, and then this year again for the women. So really, the way that it kind of worked out was I wanted to do it initially in 2021 as just a good, hard, long run when I was training for the New York City Marathon. That year, unfortunately, I was dealing with a little bit of an injury that flared up in the race itself. So I didn't feel like I was able to help as much as I wanted to. And then similarly, last year for pacing the women, what did I do last year? I ran CIM, I think, after Chicago last year. So I wanted to, again, just kind of use it as a good, hard, long run. And I thought, well, if I could go do it in a big city and have fluid support and use it as kind of a moment to reconnect with all these runners that I know and just have fun, what a great opportunity. And last year I was able to pace a good friend of mine, Emily Sisson, and then along with Emma Bates as well. So there was a potential, there was some chatter of maybe we would go for the American record, which I thought that would be really fun too. How fun could it be to pace a record setting performance? But the way that it usually works is the race hires you, and then there's a couple different avenues. It can either be for you to accompany a certain athlete, where they might say, so and so wants to go run for the women, wants to go run 2:18 flat, and they want to try to break the American record. Or you can also be hired to run a certain time. Like this year, they gave me the 2:25 group. So that was anybody that wants in the race that wants to try to run 2:25, stick with me, and I'm going to carry you as long as I can. And so our group ended up this year being, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 women and then a handful of men as well. And it was just try to hit as close to 5:32 each mile as you can, coming through the halfway point at 72:30, and really try to be dialed in and just carry that pace as long as you can. I think we did a pretty good job. And as you go through the race, people will kind of fall off the group and new people will join the group. And I think towards the end, maybe the last 6, 7, 8 miles, just as it played out this year, it kind of turned out that there was only one woman that ended up being with me, and she ended up running 2:25 and set a new personal best. So I think it was, a good day for her. And even though she wasn't feeling great, as we talked about after the race, but it's really something that I've found has given me a different focus, a different appreciation of the sport, a different approach. And I've really, really been enjoying it. So it's been a lot of fun.
Nice. I mean, but we're seeing these records getting broken. And I mean, in the last while, there's just one after another, these records getting broken. What is it? I mean, yes, technology has advanced and there's so much greater access to the knowledge around sports science and what goes into training, and just the whole mental aspect, that there's been a big focus on that nowadays as well, and training not only the physical but the mental side of things. There's so much that goes into it. But just from your point of view, what is giving these athletes this edge now that we are being able to push the boundaries as they are?
Well, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head with a couple of things you just mentioned. I think first and foremost, I think you have the technology. I think that's, kind of undisputed. I think the shoe technology now, the hydration technology, fueling, genetic testing, where people can see what their strengths are and how to really dial in their training. I mean, I think the technology itself, and as you said, the access to the information, for years, people just had to read a magazine or a newspaper to see the results from the weekend, and nobody knew what everybody else was doing. It was all this big secret, and training methods weren't widely known of how people were doing things. And I think now there's just so much access to anything you want to know. And then you combine that with the technology and kind of the emergence of training groups all around the world. And I think, recovery is so much more prioritized now maybe than it used to be. And so people are recovering better, they're training smarter, they have the equipment to train faster. I mean, I just think there's so much that's going into it. And I think there's not really any one part of that that's delivering all of the result. But I think, just the combination, the holistic nature of all of it together combined, that's really just advancing the sport in ways that a lot of people probably never thought would happen until the last couple of years, when people were like, oh, okay, this performance or that performance is inevitable. It's just going to take the right person, the right conditions, the right mentality and mindset of that person to come along and, knock down that door and break through whatever barrier we were talking about. So I think it's just been a combination of things that over the last few years has just, when you start to see these little steps being made towards, the 2-hour marathon for men or 2:10 for the women. 5 years ago, people thought neither one of those was possible. And now, we've broken 2:10 for the women, and we're 2 hours and 35 seconds for the men, or 1:59:40 if you include Elliot's performance. And I mean, just things we never thought we'd achieve in our lifetime that we're seeing now. And I don't think we're done.
No.
I think there's still a lot more, a lot further to go.
I think so. Maybe you can give us some insights into some of these new technologies and equipment and nutrition strategies. Have you tried any of them out? I mean, what have you found in your training and racing that's made a particular difference for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest, maybe most obvious one is kind of the emergence of super shoes. Everybody talks about the shoe technology and how much that can, again, not only affect how fast we can run, but how well we can recover from our training. Because I think you have kind of the dual benefit of those super shoes. And most people would probably tell you by this time they've tried them, whether from their own brand or somebody else's. I think we all kind of got started probably in the Nike super shoes. They were kind of at the forefront of that technology. And now most brands have their own iteration. And this weekend in Chicago, I raced in a new version of, I think it's going to be the 2026 version of the Under Armour shoe, which is awesome and has come, really far from the earliest versions that we started, 3, 4, 5 years ago. So that's probably been the biggest one. And then of course you've got, Normatex for recovery, the compressed air, that you basically wrap your legs in and increases your blood flow circulation. And you've got nutrition strategies. I mean, I think I've tried some of them to a point. I think at some point it becomes so overwhelming. There's like a million different products you can try, and there's so many different routes you can take, and it costs money and it costs time. And so I think for me, it's been, I'll dabble in some new things. The Morton products, nutrition products were another big one from a couple of years ago, that their hydrogel technology, their bicarb system, which I have not tried yet actually, but that's probably the next one I want to try. I've heard some great success stories, but I've also heard some horror stories of what that bicarb can do to your stomach. So definitely wanting to test that out in training before I bring it to a race day. But yeah, I mean, there's just so many different things. Ketones, another big one. HVMN, big company that's been pushing ketones that I've tried those. I think some of it is just, it becomes overwhelming to me. And I think I get some joy and satisfaction of kind of going back to the basics a little bit. I think we tend to get very distracted by these sexy new things and things you can do in training and racing. And the reality for me now is I have a full-time career in another area. And so I'm willing to really work hard in running and try, things in training, but I'm no longer really dedicating my whole life to that pursuit. So to me, training for 2-3 hours a day, plus then working on all these different recovery modalities for the other, 22 hours is just not my life anymore. And I'm okay with that. And I'm happy with that. And I think there's something to be said for, having satisfaction and happiness in your life outside of running or training or whatever sport you're doing. And that's kind of the approach that I'm taking now, instead of focusing on, am I really turning over every rock, every stone that there is that you can do in training? I'm exploring other things in life. But the things that you can look into are just endless. I mean, I think if you really wanted to, there's so many recovery things. There's so many elements of nutrition, which is probably a big one that people forget, whether, not just hydration during a race or during training, but, your nutrition, the other 22 hours a day. A lot of people probably leave that one out. Hydration, supplements, shoes, technology, how much you sweat, how you process sugar and glucose. I mean, there's so many elements. I think you could just spend an eternity digging into all of these things.
It's so interesting that you bring that up, because we've had some other chats with some other pro athletes in different sports. And I think it's quite easy to get lost in this whole scenario of, like you say, turning over every stone, looking for that little bit extra. But I guess as a pro athlete in the world that we're living in now, if you're going to make it big and make it to the top, you have to be turning over every little stone and be looking for every marginal gain, because that's what it's going to take to break the records and to stand, on top of the podium. But I think it also, what comes from a lot of athletes is that sometimes there is this dynamic of just taking the enjoyment, taking the passion out of it, because it really becomes hard work to look for those marginal gains, and so consuming, I think. So, how do you, as a pro athlete, if you just think back to the time where you were sort of really in the thick of it, how did you keep your motivation for the sport and for what you were doing each and every day, day in and day out?
Well, I think, yeah, like I mentioned, for a long time, I never had to question it. It was just, I woke up every day and I very much lived that lifestyle of all day, every day was only about my pursuit of my running. And it was very, in a way, selfish, not in a bad way, but it was like I very much had to have the focus on myself. And pretty much everything I did in a day, a week, a month, a year was all about running. So, and I never thought of anything really at the time as a sacrifice. I didn't think of, staying home instead of going out with friends, or making my own meals instead of, always going out to eat or something. I never thought of any of that as a sacrifice. I thought of it as just my dedication to my sport and my pursuit. And at some point, like I mentioned, that did kind of shift. But for a long time, I just really thought of it as, this is my dedication to this thing that I'm pursuing. And I had very much tunnel vision, focus on those goals. I had a good support team around me that supported those pursuits as well. I was making good money from the sponsor that I was with at the time. So really, I was able to have that very singular focus. And it just excited me every day to wake up and go chase that with my friends in Flagstaff. And it was just this very non-traditional, unconventional job, so to speak. I mean, it's weird to call it a job, but that really was what it was for a long time. And so what really motivated me every day was just that I hadn't achieved my potential. At the time I'm very stubborn. I do not like to give up on a goal that I set. It probably will forever in some way irk me that I never did run 210, or, that I haven't yet. I mean, I think I'm in sort of the sun is sort of setting on my career a little bit, I think, but I'll never probably say that I'm going to be totally done. I mean, I think there's always going to be that little glimmer of hope that's going to be chasing, this goal forever. And that's something that I love about running, but you never have to give it up. Like, you never know when you're going to have a breakthrough performance. But yeah, I mean, I just never questioned it. It was never even a thought in my mind to wake up and not run. Like I mentioned in the first probably couple minutes of our podcast today, it was something, and still is something, that lights me up and excites me. And I feel better on the days that I run. I feel not great on days that I don't run, even if it's like a planned day off. You can ask any of my previous coaches. I would always argue if they said, take today off. I was always someone that I had to run every single day. Now I have a little bit of a different feeling about that, but sometimes it's just out of necessity for my other work, or sometimes it's, I just ran a marathon 2 days ago and I took yesterday off. My foot was hurting. So, I'm smart about it now.
Yeah.
Whereas I would have stubbornly just pushed through before. Yeah, to really answer your question, it was just always something that lit me up. It was something that would ground me, and it's almost kind of my meditation. It was always just kind of my moment to be with myself and in nature. And most people now, you could probably ask if I would prefer running with other people or by myself. And most of the time I'd probably say by myself, just because it is that sort of meditative, I spend so much time in my life now with other people, and I'm very much an introvert. So I think I need that time to recharge my batteries. And that was always running for me. And it, started as just a passion, and then eventually grew into something that I was able to get paid to do. And it became kind of an occupation. But I think at the heart of it is always just that the kid that just loved running and loved his high school coach and loved his high school team and just wanted to have fun with the sport. And anytime life gets too serious or running gets too serious and I start to forget that, I just try to remember why I started and what got me excited about running to begin with. And it was, just being out on the trails or out in a group of people, just enjoying the camaraderie and the community of running. And I think that's what's so great about it.
Yeah, and I think so many people can relate. But looking forward, do you think that maybe some ultra events, ultra marathons, and some of these crazy things that some of these crazy people do Is that on the horizon for you, do you think?
I don't know. I get that question a lot, especially living in Flagstaff. We do have a very vibrant ultra running community. To use the expression I've used a couple times now, like it's never really been something that's tugged on my heart to go in that direction. For me, I've always thought of a marathon as being long enough, but I'll never say never. So, I don't think most people would have imagined Matt Centrowitz running a marathon this weekend. And here we are, Olympic gold medals at 1500. We went to high school together, and now he's, running a marathon. And if you ask him, it's not his foray into, doing the marathon more, but I think we'll see what happens with that. But so I'll never say never, but at the moment, it's not really on my mind.
Your radar just yet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Max, we're running out of time a little bit, but maybe we can just finish off by, I just love the fact that, the lessons that we learn in our sport and our training and the hard days and the good days and the injuries that we face and the hurdles that we need to get over are such wonderful life lessons that we can take into what comes after, a pro sporting career. And perhaps we can just finish off with that, and you can just give us some ideas and pointers of what you've taken from your pro career and what you're now using and what's coming next.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much that can apply to just life in general. I think a lot of times you see people that were dedicated, committed, successful, high-level athletes that transition into some kind of other career. And I think all of those things that you learn that make you successful in your sport tend to make you successful in life too. I mean, I think the dedication, the work ethic, the motivation, working hard on days you don't feel like doing it, but still showing up. I think there's so much that applies to life. Yeah, I'm very grateful that as a youngster, I was maybe initially, I don't even want to say like pushed into sports, but because I always enjoyed it. But I think, there's probably some level of my parents' involvement of, getting me into the stuff initially. And I'm so grateful for that now because, I think of all the lessons that I've learned from running and that commitment that I think has just set me up really well for, I'm in real estate now. And so you've got personal interactions with people and, I've traveled the world running. And so I've learned how to interact with a lot of different people from different backgrounds, different cultures. And I see that in real estate and working hard. I'm never afraid to wake up. I mean, I wake up early, I get my training done. I always start my day with training. And then I just transition right into real estate. And I can, much like running, where you can devote as little or as much time to it in a day as you like, in a career working for yourself, there's kind of similarities there where the more you put into it, the more you're probably going to get out of it to a certain extent. So I'm never afraid to work hard and just be persistent in the pursuit of whatever I'm chasing. And so now, whereas, for years I set those goals only in running, I set goals in real estate now and I chase them down and I, break them down into smaller goals to see how I can achieve them. And then every day is just a pursuit of those things that light me up. That's probably the biggest thing is, again, I feel very grateful to have found something that does light me up like running has for so many years. And now that I'm finding that in another career, I'm excited to see where I can take this other career with all the lessons that I've learned from running over the years.
Brilliant. And then just finally, if you've got some little tips for our runners who may be listening, be it any type of athlete, endurance athlete that's listening, maybe 2 or 3 pointers, something that you've learned that you could pass on to those listening?
Oh, yeah. I think one of the biggest ones for me is probably, we see living in Flagstaff, we see a lot of athletes that come to train, for maybe a month at a time or, for short periods of time and then leave. And so we get a lot of insight into how people train. And we see, of course, from social media now, how everybody's training. And one of my biggest maybe pieces of advice for younger athletes is to focus more on consistency in training versus, I think sometimes you see people that are always swinging for the fences in training. And I think that there is some value in doing that some of the time, but I think, we see so much focus again on just like what's sexy and what's exciting, and people want to do these really big workouts and they want to do these huge things in training, but then they're finding that those results aren't aligning with their race performances. And so I think we have a tendency to glamorize that hard work that's maybe beyond what you should be doing. And so I would say one of my points is to focus more on the consistency. Like consistently good training is better than, intermittent great training, or that's training that's interrupted by injuries or fatigue or burnout or lack of motivation or any of that stuff. So I would say, yeah, to really prioritize being consistent above all else and finding a way that you can do it that works for you, that keeps you happy, that keeps you healthy. And I think that you may not achieve the results as quickly doing it that way, but I think you'll set yourself up for a longer career. And I think over time, you'll start to see those results get, quicker, those performances get better, which I think in itself, getting these huge, quick jumps in performance is fun and exciting. But I think what's really gratifying is when you look back on your career and you see, okay, every year I knocked, 30 seconds to a minute off my personal best, and then maybe you have some years there's a little bit more, some years a little bit less. But I think that is maybe in some ways more exciting than, having one year that you knock 4 minutes off, and then the next year you run 5 minutes slower because you've tried to change all these things and you're burnt out and you're fatigued and you're injured and you're hurt all the time and you're miserable. So that would be probably the biggest thing, consistent training, find a way that works for you, that makes you happy, train to your strengths. Don't worry too much about what other people are focusing on or what other people are doing. You just have to find what works for you and create your own path. And that's going to be different for everybody.
Love it. Thanks, Matt. I mean, yeah, what a wonderful chat. It's been a pleasure chatting to you today and just, peeling back those layers and finding out more about what makes you tick. And I think maybe once you've had your genetic test done, we need to check in with you again and see what the learnings have been and the comparisons to what you feel you know about your body and then what the science or the genetics is telling you. But for now, that's all we've got time for. And thank you again for joining us. And we just wish you all the best in your new career and balancing the running and the career path that lies ahead. So thanks again and take care.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for having me.